She pointed at him in front of the entire room and said the words like a verdict already rendered. "You're a fraud." The whole boardroom fell completely silent. Caleb Merritt stood there in a Navy maintenance uniform, a toolbox in his hand, wordless. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at her with the steadiness that only comes from standing in places far darker than a glass-walled conference room. Nobody in that room knew what he had done, or where he had been. And the only person about to walk through that door wasn't his lawyer. Stay, because in the next few minutes, everything this woman believes about power is about to collapse. The morning arrived the way it always did for Caleb Merritt, without ceremony, without grace, just the alarm at 5:45, and the sound of the city beginning to stir outside the window of his third-floor apartment in Bridgeport. He was already awake. He usually was. The old habit of waking before the alarm had followed him out of the service and into civilian life with the loyalty of something that did not know it had been retired. He moved through the small kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that speed and stillness were not opposites. Coffee brewing, 2 slices of bread in the toaster, a glass of orange juice set on the table beside a folded paper napkin. The apartment was clean in the way that people keep things clean when they know what disorder costs, not for appearances, but as a form of respect for the day ahead. At 6:15, he heard the shuffle of small feet from the hallway. Liam appeared in the kitchen doorway, 8 years old, dark hair still pushed flat from sleep, backpack already looped over one shoulder, as though he had decided the previous night that morning would not catch him unprepared. He sat down, pulled the orange juice toward him, and ate the toast without being asked. They moved through the morning together, in the easy rhythm of 2 people who had been sharing the same small space long enough to know how not to interrupt each other. Before they left, as Caleb was locking the apartment door, Liam pressed a folded square of paper into his front pocket without a word. On the walk to the bus stop, Caleb unfolded it. Drawn in green crayon, slightly crooked, 2 words printed in careful capital letters. "Win today, Dad." He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with the paper in his hand, the morning traffic moving past him on either side, and felt the particular weight of something that does not need to be explained to be understood. He folded it carefully, tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform, and pressed his palm flat against it before letting go. The Vantex Corporation Tower rose 42 stories above the Chicago skyline, a column of glass and steel that caught the early light and threw it back across the surrounding streets in long, pale streaks. Caleb pushed his maintenance cart through the service entrance at 6:58, nodded to the security desk, took the freight elevator to the basement technical room, and pulled the morning's work orders from the wire basket. 3 calls logged overnight. 2 were routine. The third was a flag on the HVAC control system for the 31st floor, the executive level. The notation read, "Primary load distribution module, repeated fault cycling, unresolved." Caleb had flagged this same module 2 weeks earlier. He had written a recommendation in the work order system, specified the replacement part by model number, and noted that the fault would escalate without intervention. The note had been read. The part had not been ordered. Carter, the executive assistant who managed facilities requests for the upper floors, had simply closed the ticket. Caleb had noted this without comment, the way he noted most things he could not control accurately, and without wasting energy on what was already decided. He loaded the cart and rode the elevator up. Diana Ashworth did not look at maintenance staff as a rule, not from deliberate cruelty, but because in the architecture of her attention, they were infrastructure rather than people. She had built Vantex Corporation over 16 years, beginning with a mid-tier regional property firm that most industry analysts had written off as overextended, and ending with one of the most strategically aggressive infrastructure and technology conglomerates in the Midwest. She had done it through a quality of focus that was almost physical in its density, the ability to identify the critical path through any situation and move along it without being slowed by peripheral information. At 39, she had been described as brilliant so many times that the word had lost all texture. Forbes had named her a builder of the decade, 2 years running. She kept the plaques in a storage closet on the 14th floor. She did not need them on the wall to remember. What she remembered, what she had always used as her compass, was simpler and more reliable than any award. The certainty that she understood the situation in front of her better than almost anyone else in the room. This certainty had served her well for 16 years. It had never, in any meaningful way, been proven wrong. Today was the most important meeting in 3 years. A defense contract worth $160 million, a formal partnership with the United States Department of Defense to design and deploy electrical energy control systems for military installations in active conflict. SONIS. The presentation was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. Sofia Vargas, Vantex's senior systems engineer, sat at the far end of the conference table with her laptop open, her expression carrying a tightness that Diana had noticed and chosen not to address. The previous afternoon, Sofia had submitted a written flag, a load distribution error in Section 3 of the technical proposal, a missing 11% loss compensation coefficient for high-temperature operating environments. She had said, quietly and precisely, that if the system were deployed in a region where ambient temperatures exceeded 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the distribution grid would become unstable. Diana had read the flag, looked at the presentation schedule, and made a decision. No changes at this stage. The proposal stood as written. Sofia had closed her laptop and said nothing more. Now the morning of the presentation had arrived, and the error sat in Sofia's chest the way real errors do, quietly, persistently, refusing to behave as though being ignored made it smaller. Caleb reached the 31st floor and parked his cart in the service corridor. The HVAC fault was exactly what he had expected. The load distribution module had been cycling irregularly, and the cycling had finally produced cascade errors in the secondary loop. He connected his diagnostic reader, studied the output, and began sketching the correction on the notepad clipped to his board. His handwriting was small and precise. The sketch included not just a repair path, but a full reconfiguration of the load sequencing a proper resolution rather than a temporary suppression of the symptom. He had done this kind of work for long enough that the thinking and the doing had become almost simultaneous. His hands moved, while his mind had already checked the correction against the secondary system parameters and confirmed the clearances. It was the way all good technical work eventually becomes, not faster or slower than careful, but identical to it. The technical room opened onto a service corridor running parallel to the glass-walled conference room at the far end of the floor. Sofia had stepped out to investigate the intermittent mechanical hum that had been coming through the wall for the past several minutes. She found Caleb in the corridor, crouched beside the open access panel, diagnostic reader balanced on one knee. She looked at the panel. She looked at the notepad in his hands. "Is that the primary load distribution module?" she asked. "Yes. You said it faults in heat stress conditions? Drops 11% load capacity when the system temperature exceeds threshold. It's a sequencing issue. The module isn't compensating for thermal resistance in the secondary loop under sustained heat load." He glanced at her. "I flagged it 2 weeks ago." Sofia went very still. She stepped closer and looked at his notepad, the diagram, the correction pathway, the numbers arranged in careful columns. An engineer reading another engineer's work does not need to be told what they are looking at. She knew within 10 seconds. "Come with me," she said. He followed her into the conference room. The presentation was open on the main screen. Sofia pulled up Section 3, the load distribution schematic, and turned the laptop toward him. Caleb studied the numbers. His eyes moved the same way they always moved over technical data. Fast, precise, pausing at each point where the load calculation could fail. He set his toolbox down. He took the pen from his shirt pocket and asked if he could write on the margin of her printed copy. She handed it over without hesitation. He had been writing carefully, each step laid out in sequence, the correction path annotated at each stage for about 40 seconds when the conference room door opened and Diana walked in. She registered the maintenance uniform first, then the toolbox. Then the fact that this person was standing at her presentation screen with a pen in his hand, writing on her materials. She did not ask for an explanation. She had already formed her conclusion. "Who gave you access to this room?" Caleb turned. "No alarm, no apology. Sofia asked me in." Diana looked at Sofia for 1 second, then back at Caleb. Her voice was controlled, the way voices are controlled when "This is a restricted meeting space. You do not have authorization to be here, and you do not have authorization to handle those materials. There's an error in your load distribution model," Caleb said. His voice was level, not challenging, not deferential, simply direct, the voice of a person describing a fact that does not require their opinion to be true. The loss compensation coefficient for high-temperature environments is missing from column 3. If this system is deployed in a region where ambient temperatures exceed 40 degrees Celsius, the distribution grid will lose load integrity across the entire installation. The 5 R&D team members at the table exchanged glances. No one spoke. Diana looked at him for a moment longer than strictly necessary. When she responded, there was a lightness in her voice, the specific lightness of someone who has already filed a situation and is simply completing the step of closing it. "Where did you learn that?" she said. "Online?" 2 people at the table laughed. It was brief, the reflex sound of relief rather than amusement. Caleb heard it clearly. He did not look at them. "The coefficient is wrong," he said, the same way he had said it the first time. "The correction is written on page 3. Every step is there." "I'm sure it is," Diana said. She looked at Carter, who had appeared in the doorway. "Please take him back where he belongs." Caleb picked up his toolbox. He walked past Carter without resistance, without visible anger, without the particular stiffness that comes from swallowing something. He stopped at the door, not facing Diana, but facing the presentation screen, and spoke in the same tone he had used throughout. "The HVAC will be running in 15 minutes, he said. "The numbers on that printout are correct. Whether that matters to you before 3 o'clock is a decision only you can make." He walked out. Sophia stood in the quiet that followed and looked at the printout in her hand. The handwriting in the margin was neat and unhurried, written with the patience of a man accustomed to delivering technical corrections in conditions worse than this, in cold, in heat, in the kind of darkness where clarity is the only instrument that keeps people alive. She read through it once, then again. Every word of it was right. She had known it was right before she finished the first line, because she had spent the previous day running the same mental calculation and arriving at the same answer, and the only difference between herself and the man who had just been escorted out was that she had been afraid to say it clearly. The basement maintenance room was cool and lit by fluorescent panels that hummed faintly at the edges of hearing. Caleb returned to the service corridor, completed the HVAC reconfiguration, and ran the test cycle twice. The system cleared both times, exactly as he had calculated. He recorded the work in the log, signed the bottom of the sheet, and clipped it to the board. He sat on the edge of his cart for a moment. Not to rest. He sat because the body sometimes asks for a pause that the mind has already moved past, and it costs nothing to give it one. He thought about the numbers on the slide without particular feeling. He had recognized the error in 30 seconds, not because he was gifted at finding errors in other people's work, but because he had spent 7 years working with systems exactly like it in places where an 11% load loss was not a presentation problem. It was a blackout. It was a communications failure. It was 300 soldiers without water treatment or medical equipment in 110-degree heat. 12 years earlier, Caleb Merritt had graduated from West Point in the spring, at 23 years old, with a degree in electrical engineering and systems design. He had ranked in the top 3% of his graduating class. The summer after graduation, he had been selected for a specialized training program within Army Special Forces, a program that trained combat engineers not to fight from the front, but to keep the infrastructure alive that made everything else possible: power, water, communications, the bones of operations that no one ever mentions in the accounts of what happened. 7 years, 3 deployments, Afghanistan twice, Iraq once, and a third posting that had no official designation in any document he was permitted to reference. He had not been a soldier in the conventional sense. He had been the person who kept the lights on in places where the lights going out meant people died. He had worked with equipment that had never been designed for the conditions it was deployed in, improvised solutions in the field that later made their way into formal documentation, and learned firsthand that the gap between what engineering standards required and what the field actually demanded was a gap that could only be closed by someone willing to stand in both places at once. After his wife was killed in a car accident on a Tuesday night in November, he had filed for discharge. Not because he couldn't continue, he could have. But Liam was 5 years old, and a boy needs at least one parent who comes home reliably, at the same hour, every night, without the uncertainty of what tomorrow might require. He pulled the folded square of paper from his breast pocket. "Win today, Dad." He held it for a moment, then placed his palm flat against it, felt the slight pressure against his chest, and breathed. He put it back and went to finish the last 2 calls of the morning. He picked Liam up from the bus stop at 3:45. The boy was carrying a rolled drawing secured with a rubber band, which he transferred to Caleb in exchange for nothing, as though the circulation of artwork between them was simply a standard feature of their days together. "It's the solar system," Liam said, falling into step beside him. "But I made Pluto bigger because I think it deserves it." "It doesn't meet the orbital clearing criterion," Caleb said. "I know. I felt bad for it anyway." They walked half a block in comfortable silence. Then Liam said, without looking up, "Did something happen today?" "Why do you ask?" "You're being extra quiet." "I'm always quiet. Extra quiet," Liam said, with the precision of someone who has been paying attention for 8 years and does not make distinctions carelessly. Caleb was quiet for another half block. "Someone disagreed with me today, about something I knew was correct." Liam considered this with the seriousness he brought to anything that seemed important. "Did they know you were right? They didn't want to be." Liam nodded. "My teacher says the hardest kind of right is the kind people don't want to hear. She says those are the ones worth saying anyway." Caleb did not respond. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted barely perceptible, the way ground shifts before settling into a more honest position. That evening they made pasta from the box because it was Tuesday, and Tuesday was pasta night, a rule Liam had established 18 months earlier, with a firmness that suggested he had considered the matter carefully and was not interested in revisiting it. They did math homework at the kitchen table, while the water boiled fractions, which Liam approached with the methodical patience he brought to anything he had decided was worth understanding. Caleb sat across from him and let him find his own errors, offering corrections only when the boy had genuinely arrived at a wall rather than simply a pause. After dinner, after the dishes, after the reading and the lights going off in the small bedroom at the end of the hall, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that he did not drink so much as keep company. On the table in front of him was the rough notation he had kept the correction he had written from memory, the same sequence he had laid out in Sophia's margin. He looked at it in the quiet without doing anything with it. Sometimes the true shape of a day only becomes visible when all the movement has stopped. Carter sent the internal email at 8:47. Subject: The body noted that an employee named Caleb Merritt had entered a restricted meeting space without authorization and handled proprietary technical materials belonging to the executive team. It recommended a formal review of his contract status. Sophia received a copy by accident. Her name appeared in the incident description, which generated an automatic distribution. She read it at 9:12, her coffee going cold beside her keyboard. She looked at it for a long time. Diana's phone call came later that evening. The instructions were brief. Find out who this man is, where he trained, why he is here. Carter spent 90 minutes in the HR database and returned with almost nothing useful. Caleb Merritt, 37 years old, hired 14 months earlier through a third-party facilities contractor. A technical certificate from a community college in Joliet. No university degree on file. No prior employment history beyond a general notation of previous contract maintenance work. Diana had listened and felt the architecture of her original read confirm itself. Self-taught, she concluded. The kind of person who absorbs technical vocabulary from manuals and forums and mistakes, fluency with language, for depth of knowledge. She had encountered that type before. It was not an uncommon type. It was, in fact, the type she had learned to identify early in her career, confident without credential, persuasive without rigor, dangerous in proportion to how convincing they sounded. She had closed the phone call with the particular satisfaction of a person who has investigated a doubt and found it groundless. She did not realize until much later that the investigation she had commissioned was designed to confirm what she already believed, and that this was not the same thing as looking for the truth. What she could not know, what Carter's search had no mechanism to reach without a Department of Defense verification credential, was that Caleb's Vantex employment file contained only what a maintenance position required. Everything else, West Point The commission, the 3 deployments, the classified 3rd posting whose country of operation appeared in no public document, the commendation letters, the co-authorship of a revised military infrastructure standard. All of it existed behind a federal access threshold that no corporate HR system had ever been designed to cross. The following morning, 5 representatives of the Department of Defense arrived at Vantex for the preliminary technical review. The group was led by Wyatt Donnell, a civilian technical advisor in his early 50s, with the measured authority of someone who has reviewed enough proposals to recognize, within 10 minutes, whether a team understands what they are describing. Sophia had not slept. She had worked through the night, correcting Section 3, running the recalculated numbers 3 times across 3 different environmental models. The corrected proposal was not simply fixed, it was better. The approach Caleb had sketched reduced projected load variance by 18% across the full operating temperature range. She had stared at this result for some time before she accepted it completely. When Wyatt Donnell reached Section 3 and paused, Sophia felt the stillness enter the room before he spoke. She had been watching him from the moment he sat down. He had the manner of someone who does not need to perform attention because attention is simply how he operates, present, methodical, without the fidgeting of a man who wants to be somewhere else. He had stopped twice before Section 3, both times to ask questions that were polite in phrasing and surgically precise in intent. The 3rd stop, at Section 3, was different. He was quiet for longer than he had been quiet before. This section has been revised since the draft submitted for preliminary review, he said. A statement, not a question. Yes, Sophia said. What was corrected? A load compensation error. A missing coefficient in the distribution model. Who identified it? The room held its breath. Diana sat at the head of the table. Her gaze moved to Sophia and carried a weight that was not quite a warning, but was close enough to one that the difference was academic. Sophia looked back at her. Then she turned to Wyatt Donnell. A building technician, she said. His name is Caleb Merritt. Wyatt Donnell set his pen on the table. He was still for a moment, the particular stillness of someone organizing a thought they are not ready to share. He took out his phone, typed something brief and deliberate, and returned it to his pocket without comment or explanation. The meeting continued. But something had entered the room that had not been there before, and everyone present, in their own way, felt it. Carter knocked on Diana's office door at 4 in the afternoon. His expression did not match any category of news she was accustomed to receiving. There's someone in the lobby. No appointment. He's asking for whoever is managing the defense contract. Name? General Joseph Hargrove. Diana set her pen down. 4 stars, Carter said. He currently commands the Military Strategic Energy Command. That's the office that approves all electrical infrastructure contracts for overseas deployment. Diana was on her feet before he finished. General Joseph Hargrove was standing in the center of the Vantex lobby with the kind of stillness that has nothing to do with inactivity. He was not in uniform dark charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie, but his bearing made the question of rank entirely beside the point. He was 61 years old, built with the lean economy of someone who had spent decades in conditions that rewarded efficiency over everything else, and his eyes moved across the lobby with the automatic, comprehensive sweep of a man whose relationship with new environments is always first professional. The lobby staff had given him the center of the room without being asked, and the security desk attendant had stood a little straighter without knowing exactly why. There are people who command space not by demanding it but by simply existing within it, and Hargrove was entirely one of those people. Diana crossed the lobby, with her hand extended and her composure fully assembled. He shook her hand once, briefly. She led him to the 31st floor conference room. He sat down, placed both hands flat on the table, and looked at her with the particular directness of someone who has not come here to waste time. I understand Caleb Merritt is employed in this building, he said. He's in our facilities department. Building maintenance? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Caleb Merritt was one of 8 officers I personally nominated for early promotion to major before he filed for discharge in 2019. I made that recommendation because I assessed him as the most capable field infrastructure engineer I had worked with in 30 years of active service. Diana held her expression. He designed the mobile electrical distribution system that restored full power to 3 NATO forward operating bases in Kandahar province after a coordinated attack destroyed the primary grid. He completed the restoration in 72 hours with a team of 6 in temperatures exceeding 115 degrees Fahrenheit without resupply. Every system he designed that week is still operational today. Not one has experienced a critical failure. He paused. The technical standard your proposal is required to meet Military Standard 1399, Section 5, governing field deployable electrical distribution. Caleb Merritt is a co-author of the most recent revision. He and one other engineer updated that document in 2018 based on field data that existed nowhere else, because no one else had been where they had been. He looked at her steadily. I came here because Wyatt Donnell contacted my office this morning. He told me that the corrected version of your proposal had been flagged as the work of a building maintenance technician named Caleb Merritt, and that this same technician had been removed from a meeting when he attempted to identify the original error. I wanted to understand that account from you directly. Carter found Caleb on the basement floor finishing the last work order of the day and rode up with him in the service elevator without speaking. The elevator was small and functional, and the silence between them had a particular quality, the silence of a man who had sent an email he wished he hadn't, standing next to the subject of that email, in a space too small to pretend otherwise. Caleb rode up without looking at him, without making it harder or easier than it was. When the doors opened, he walked into the conference room in his uniform, toolbox in hand. He set the toolbox beside the door. He straightened up and looked across the room and saw General Hargrove. He stopped. A single brief pause, less than 2 seconds. Then something shifted in his posture, not dramatically, but every person in the room saw it. The particular adjustment of a man in the presence of someone whose authority he recognizes not from obligation but from experience. 7 years leave a residue that 3 years of civilian life cannot dissolve. Sir Merritt. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes between strangers last. It was the handshake of 2 men who had stood in the same rooms, breathed the same air under the same kind of pressure, and who understand without needing to say it that the other person's continued presence is not something to take lightly. Diana watched this exchange and felt the floor of her certainty begin to shift beneath her. General Hargrove turned to face her. His voice was unhurried and completely clear. First Lieutenant Caleb Merritt, West Point, Class of 2012, Electrical Engineering and Systems Design. Top 3% of his graduating class, 3 combat deployments, 8 service commendations, awarded the Army Commendation Medal for Valor in 2017 for restoring the Kandahar installation grid under hostile conditions. He let that settle for a moment. The technical standard your proposal must satisfy, co-authored by Caleb Merritt in 2018, based on field experience that no one in this room has had and no classroom could provide. When he walked into this conference room and told you there was an error in your proposal, he was not guessing. He was reading a document that failed to meet a standard he helped write in the field, in conditions where failure is measured not in contracts but in lives. He looked at her directly, and your response was to call him a fraud. The silence that followed was complete. Sophia looked at her hands. Carter studied the table. The 5 R&D team members who had been present the previous day sat with the particular stillness of people who are reconsidering something they had thought was already settled. Caleb stood throughout this with the same quality he had carried for the past 24 hours, the composure of someone who has stood in rooms where the stakes were genuinely unsurvivable and who understands at a fundamental level that a glass-walled conference room in Chicago is not one of them, regardless of what anyone says inside it. Sophia asked the question before she had entirely decided to ask it. Her voice was quiet, not quite directed at anyone in particular, but landing where it was intended to land. Why didn't you say anything? When she called you that, why didn't you defend yourself? Caleb turned to her. When he spoke, there was no performance in it, no emphasis placed for effect. The correction was on the page, he said. Anyone willing to read it would find it. Anyone who wasn't saying more wouldn't change that. He paused. I don't work to convince people. I work to make sure the right things don't fail. General Hargrove notified Diana that the formal contract presentation the following morning was being postponed. The Department of Defense required a complete reassessment of Vantex's technical team and verification processes before any commitment could proceed. He was not withdrawing the contract. He was holding it, pending evidence that the team responsible for execution met the standard the contract demanded. That standard is not negotiable, he said. It was written by people who built these systems with their hands in conditions where failure was not a budget line. It will be applied as written. He and Caleb left together. At the door, Hargrove paused and said something quietly to Caleb that no one in the room could hear. Caleb nodded. They walked out. The room that remained contained Diana, Carter, and Sophia, and a silence with the specific weight of the undeniable. Carter started. "We could?" "No," Diana said. Her voice was still controlled, still hers. But it carried a different quality than it had carried the previous morning. The certainty was still present. Diana Ashworth was not a woman who dissolved, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. A small, clean gap, the size of an 11% coefficient, where the certainty did not reach and had apparently never been able to reach, even when she did not know it. She looked at Caleb's handwriting on the printout Sophia had left on the table. Small, precise, written with the patience of a man who had delivered technical corrections in conditions where there was no time for anything except what was necessary, and no margin for anything except what was correct. "He knew I wasn't going to listen," Diana said. "Not a question." Sophia nodded. "Then why write it down at all?" Sophia was quiet for a moment. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said finally. "Whether anyone read it or not." Diana sat with that answer. She did not argue with it, did not qualify it, did not look for the leverage point that would let her set it aside. She sat with it the way you sit with something that has the specific gravity of a truth you have not previously been required to carry somewhere below the sternum, quietly insistent, asking nothing of you, except that you stop pretending you haven't felt it. She had been wrong before. Every person who builds anything is wrong, frequently and expensively. But those wrongs had been correctable, auditable, foldable into the next decision. She had always been able to look at her mistakes and understand them as problems of information, things she had not known, variables she had not accounted for, positions held until the data changed. This was a different category. She had had the information. Sophia had brought it to her directly, in writing, in the afternoon before the presentation. She had chosen not to act on it, and then she had encountered it again in the margin of a printout written by the person she had dismissed as incapable, and she had still chosen to do nothing until circumstance made the choice unavoidable. This was the kind of wrong that does not ask for a correction. It asks for something quieter and more permanent and considerably harder to produce. She did not yet know what she would do with it, but she knew she could not file it away. The maintenance floor was quiet at 6 in the evening. Caleb was running through the closeout checklist when he heard footsteps in the corridor that moved with a different quality than the building's usual traffic. General Hargrove stood in the doorway. No aide, no vehicle waiting at the service entrance. Just the man himself, jacket over one arm, looking at Caleb the way he had looked at him in the field, with the specific regard of one professional for another, which requires no ceremony because it has already been established. "You're still doing the checklist," Hargrove said. "It needs to be done." Hargrove sat in the single plastic chair along the wall, with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with functional rooms and functional furniture. "I have a proposal. Not an order. A proposal. The Strategic Energy Command is rebuilding the next-generation field electrical distribution standard. We need someone who knows the material from the inside to lead the documentation. Advisory contract. Remote work. You set the hours. Compensation equivalent to major's pay." Caleb continued loading the cart. "I have an 8-year-old. I know. He needs me home by 7. Remote work. No deployment. You work around what the boy needs." Caleb straightened and looked at the window. The Chicago evening was arranging itself in layers, the last pale light retreating from the western edge of the sky, the orange wash of the street lamps arriving below, the cold glass of the tower reflecting everything at once. He had stood in darker places looking at considerably less, and found reasons that were sufficient. "I'll think about it," he said. Hargrove stood, pulled his jacket on, and moved toward the door with the ease of a man who has said what he came to say and has no need to add to it. At the doorway, he paused. "You know what I remember most about you in Kandahar?" Caleb looked at him. "You never needed anyone to know what you were doing. You just needed the lights to stay on." He left. Caleb stood alone in the maintenance room for a moment. Then he sat down on the edge of his cart, reached into his breast pocket, and unfolded the green crayon drawing. "Win today, Dad." He read it, held it for a moment, then folded it back with the same care he brought to anything that could not be replaced. He pressed it back over his heart and went home. The city was fully dark by the time he pushed his cart through the service entrance and onto the sidewalk. Behind him, the Vantex Tower rose 42 stories into the night sky. Every floor lit from within a column of steady light, climbing upward into the cold above Chicago, burning the way buildings burn, when the people inside them are still working, still deciding, still trying to understand what the day has asked of them. He had kept lights like these burning in places that did not have names. He understood, better than anyone currently standing inside that tower, exactly what it cost to do so. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him that required looking at. Somewhere on the 31st floor, a woman sat alone at a conference table with a handwritten correction on a piece of paper and the beginning of an understanding she had not previously been required to develop, that competence does not announce itself, that it wears what it needs to wear, and that the most dangerous assumption a person can make is that they already know the shape of the thing standing in front of them. Somewhere in a third-floor apartment in Bridgeport, a boy in blue pajamas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of warm milk and a math worksheet, his pencil moving carefully in the quiet, the scratch of it the only sound in the room, waiting for a particular footstep on the stair, waiting for the specific sound of one key turning in one specific lock. And Caleb Merritt, the man who had kept the lights burning in places that do not appear on any public map, who had written the standard that others were now trying to sell, who had been called a fraud in a glass-walled room, and had walked out carrying nothing but the truth, and a folded piece of paper covered in green crayon, moved through the evening streets of his city with his cart and his toolbox, and the weight of his own quiet competence, which had never required an audience to be real. He had not won by shouting. He had not won by proving anything to anyone who had chosen not to see. He had won the only way that lasts by remaining, in every room and every condition and every moment when it would have been easier to be something else, exactly who he was. And in his breast pocket, pressed close against his chest, a small green drawing was waiting to be proved right.